When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
This is the moment.
The Bachelorette is back. Yeah! And the power
I'm gonna fall in love.
is in Jen's hands.
And I'm gonna do it my way.
ABC tonight.
Everything about her is great.
I feel so special.
Jen's looking like a queen.
My men are very, very hot.
Someone call 911. You are looking so fire.
This is the beginning of a new era.
The Bachelorette season premiere tonight, 8/7 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. Well, it's been just over a week now since I returned from my amazing trip to England. And while I'm not really sure if it's really sunk in yet, all of the things that I've experienced, I am very grateful for the opportunities that I had while I was there. So today, I'd like to share with you one of the gorgeous places that I visited while I was in Kent.
You're listening to the Tudors Dynasty podcast with Rebecca Larson.
Having twice fallen into disrepair, Penshurst Place in Kent has risen from the ashes to stand today as one of the most remarkable estates in England. During my visit to England, I looked for Tudor history wherever I traveled, and Penshurst Place did not disappoint. Here's a bit of history on the place, and then I'll wrap up with my own experience. Construction on Penshurst was completed in 1341 under the reign of King Edward III, and stood during such events as the Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt, and the 100 Years' War. After the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, and with the threat of foreign invasion as his motivator, Sir John Devereux set about enclosing the Penshurst Place manor with a massive system of crenellated curtain walks and turrets, so creating a defended manor house. Its notable owners include John, Duke of Bedford in 1401. Bedford was Henry IV's son and Henry V's younger brother. There was construction under the Duke of Bedford, referred to as the Buckingham Building. His emblems, the falcon and the ibex, adorn its gables. After Bedford's death in 1435, Penshurst Place became the property of his younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Gloucester owned it until he died in 1447, when it was passed to the first Duke of Buckingham, Humphrey Stafford, who was killed during the Wars of the Roses at the Battle of Northampton in 1460. After his death, the property was inherited by his grandson, Henry Stafford, now second Duke of Buckingham. When the second Duke was executed for treason under the reign of Richard III, his son, Edward Stafford, became the third Duke of Buckingham. The third Duke's mother was Catherine Woodville. Now you know her as the sister of Elizabeth Woodville, King Edward IV's queen consort. Catherine was married to Jasper Tudor, uncle of Henry VII, after the execution of her husband in 1483, and after Henry VII succeeded the throne in 1485. Penshurst remained for a longer period under the third Duke of Buckingham, and in 1519, Edward Stafford hosted Henry VIII at Penshurst and lavished on the king an extravagant stay, costing him an impressive £2,500, or £1 million by today's standards. Unfortunately, such an impressive showcase of wealth didn't help his cause, and not long after, he was executed for treason. His wealth and lineage a threat to the paranoid King Henry VIII. After the execution of the third Duke of Buckingham by Henry VIII in 1520, Penshurst reverted to the crown and was used as a hunting lodge. The king visited there with his good friend Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, during his courtship with Anne Boleyn. Anne's family estate of Hever Castle was not quite 6 miles away by today's travel standards. Now, we'll touch back shortly on Brandon's familial ties to Penshurst. Fast forward to the death of Henry VIII. Penshurst Place became the property of his son and heir, King Edward VI. King Edward VI was keen to reward the services of his tutor and steward of his household, Sir William Sidney. He saw Penshurst Place as a fitting gift, and the house and its estate, located not far from the Sidney Ironworks in Sussex, were given to William in 1552. Thus began the long and fascinating history of the Sidney family at Penshurst Place. Let's now revisit the connection between Charles Brandon and the Sidney family that I mentioned just a moment ago. Charles Brandon's paternal aunt, Anne Brandon, was married to William Sidney. Their son, Henry Sidney, inherited Penshurst Place. Sir Henry Sidney had spent his childhood at court as constant companion of the young Prince Edward, and on his accession as King Edward VI, Sir Henry remained his closest friend. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Sir Henry also became one of her most faithful servants. Henry made substantial additions to the house at Penshurst, with alterations to the Buckingham Building, adding an attic story and dividing the first-floor hall into a series of staterooms, which are now known as the Queen Elizabeth and Tapestry Rooms. Sir Henry Sidney's son Philip was a well-known poet during the Elizabethan era and had married one of the daughters of Sir Francis Walsingham, Queen Elizabeth's spymaster. Having died in 1586, shortly after his father, Philip did not inherit Penshurst, but instead it went to his younger brother Robert. Sir Robert Sidney owned Penshurst Place when Queen Elizabeth made a visit there in 1599. Robert Sidney owned it until his death in 1626, when Charles I was on the throne. Since then, Penshurst has remained in the possession of the Sidney family. The gardens at Penshurst Place are exquisite. While I was in England, I visited many gardens, and to be honest with you, gardens never excited me as much as the actual buildings. But the gardens at Penshurst Place were expansive and stunning. I had a lovely time walking around them, enjoying not only the sounds of nature, but also the nearby church bells. As I walked toward the yew hedge, I spotted an opening, and through it I could see water jetting out in the middle of a pool. I was surprised to see what is referred to as Diana's Bath. Diana's Bath is formed from an Elizabethan stew pond. There is lovely stonework around the pool that dates to the 19th century, and how it received the name Diana's Bath is unknown. While walking around the large pool, I gazed down into the water to see rather large fish shadowing my every move. They came right up to the surface like they were used to being fed that way, but sadly, I had nothing to give them. Actually, I wouldn't have without permission of the property to do so. I sat for a moment and talked to one of the fish in particular, who seemed to take a liking to me. I asked him if he was interested in dating me. Unfortunately, he didn't respond. So I'm still on the lookout for an English bloke. The views at Penshurst Place Manor from the gardens are spectacular. I took several photos of it to try and capture its beauty. But one of the things I realized on my trip to England is that nothing matches the human eye. No matter how many photographs I took, none compare to seeing this in person. If you're ever in Kent, quite possibly visiting the more popular Hever Castle, I highly recommend visiting the stunningly beautiful Penshurst Place. Sometimes it's more important to visit the lesser-known historical buildings because you never know what you could be missing out on. I'd like to give a special thanks and credit to the Penshurst Place website and the book I bought from their gift shop, which helped me with a lot of information and quotes used in this episode. Thank you so much for joining me again on another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Until next time. I had a fantastic time in England and will be going back as soon as I can. Would you like to come with me?
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.